Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ and I am happy to welcome you all to today's user share with Tim Mangan. And before we get into that, just want to let any of you know who are not familiar with CUGC that you can come out to mycugc.org and take a look around. We have lots of forums where you can ask questions, get lots of expert help and advice, and we have blog posts that are great for you guys, and also we have a lot of local groups for you to get plugged into, so it would be great if you come on out, find your local group, find a meeting, and get involved. All right, before we get to our main presentation, I want to introduce our moderator today. It's Tobias Kreidel. He is the VP of the CUGC Steering Committee, and he is a CTP and is located out at Northern Arizona University. Tobias, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone, from wherever you are in the world. Welcome, and so glad you could come today.
Awesome. And just a quick reminder for all of you to type your questions into the question area of the GoToWebinar control panel. Tobias is going to keep an eye on those for us today, and he will ask them depending on the flow. He'll ask them throughout the presentation. Some of them we, of course, might have to save for the end. We'll just see how it goes. And Tobias, I think you are very knowledgeable about Tim and his biography, so you want to give him a quick little introduction?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to. Well, it's a great pleasure once again to have the opportunity to introduce Tim, who is seen worldwide as one of the foremost AppV gurus. He has been a long time Citrix technology professional. He has a very long history in the industry, helping with a number of different companies, covering everything from such entities as Softricity and Avanti Communications and InfiniNet and computer vision and many other different areas. He also has some experience in the bank industry, and it's been a pleasure to have him also be awarded by Microsoft the Most Valuable Professional Award for AppV. And as I mentioned earlier, he's not only a distinguished Citrix technology professional, but was just bestowed upon him the award of a Citrix Technology Professional Fellow. So he is one of only 5 such recipients currently. So a hearty congratulations to him on that. And with that, I will turn it over to Tim, who will give you all kinds of very interesting information. And one last thing, Tim is willing to take some questions in the course of his talk. If the numbers become too excessive, I will hold those off until the end of the webinar, and we will try and fit those in as best as possible. I should note that the webinar will be recorded. Usually within a day or two, the recording is made available. There will also be a discussion session available on the CUGC website in the event that some of your questions cannot be fielded today. So feel free, under those circumstances, to continue the dialogue on the CUGC website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim.
Okay, well, thank you, Tobias. Welcome, everybody. What we've got on tap today is a little bit of continuation of the session we did quite some time ago now. I think it was probably in the spring or early summer. I don't know if you remember, Tobias, but we talked about integrating AppV with Citrix. And I got a couple of things on tap for today. One is I've been continuing to evolve what I am now calling this modern techniques for application preparation. But the second, and at the end here, we'll talk about a particular issue that's been coming up with a number of customers in integrating AppV in through Studio and I'll show you how I'm dealing with that right now. So let me just jump up here. Excuse me. So last time we talked about the application lifecycle, and we're really kind of focusing here in this center section where we are preparing the application. We're trying to assess the application, prepare it, test it, and get ready for that deployment. And that's what we're going to be focusing in on here. And one of the questions that I want to ask folks that are on the call here is really, how many times does someone in your company figure out how to install and package up and deliver the same application? I'm typically dealing with larger enterprises, and they're using different kinds of technologies to deliver applications to different parts of their organization. They usually have different groups are involved, and they're using totally different tooling. And quite often what I find in these larger enterprises is that the same app is being worked on by multiple people multiple times, and there's no cross communication going on, and they're really kind of reinventing the wheel each time. And I really think it's time for that to stop in the enterprise. So I'm going to talk about a way that you can do that, and it's something for you to be thinking about moving forward. So I did write an article about this. I do some writing now for a tech target property called Access, and that's a link to that article that you can check out that kind of talks about that in a little more detail than we have time to talk about here. But when it comes to AppV, the key thing that I'm trying to pull out and point out to people is that we shouldn't be thinking about AppV as a single thing today. But in fact, we should be thinking about it as a format. The output of the AppV sequencer is this AppV file format. And then we can use that in the AppV client to do client virtualization. But I think as we move into the future, I'm hoping that we're going to see more options to use that format in different ways, so that we can use AppV as kind of the packaging format for the enterprise to get the application ready. And then from there, we can choose how to go out and deploy that. And that's my concept moving forward. We're not really quite there yet, but I'll show you where we are now. So the way that I end up working with this is I spend some time automating the installation of the application, and I use the AppV sequencer to do this initial capture so that I can see exactly what's in this package. And then I run a tool of mine that's a free tool that's out for the community called AppV Manage that has this analyzer in it. And it analyzes that application and tells us an awful lot about what's in that application, and specifically things that are wrong with it. And the work that I've been doing in the last year and a half has been helping automate fixing those problems. And so we'll have a button there that you can hit, it'll generate a script, and we can go back to the automation now and run through this process again and end up with a much better application package. And once I go through that process and I'm happy with it, I then have some choices. I mean, I've got an AppV package and I can deploy that through AppV. Today, I can just take that automation that I have and use that as part of any way in the company that you want to deploy that application. So if what you were going to do is you're going to use MDT and put it as part of your base image, you can do that. This is your new customized installer for the way you want that application to appear. If you want to do app layering, you can put it into the app layer using that installer. If you're going to use Configuration Manager to push out to physical desktops, you could use it as your package for that as well. Now, ideally, I'd like to just take the AppV package file that I created and do that, and that's where I'm hoping we go to in the long run. But at a minimum today, you can take those automated scripts and use it in multiple ways depending on how you need to deploy that application to this particular part of your organization. The result out of this, though, is really to try to come up with a way to have the simplest possible deployment that produces the best possible end user experience. A lot of the things that we're fixing through the analyzer here and these automated fixes are making it a better user experience for when the user gets that application. Taking care of things that software developers didn't necessarily include in their package in the way that they're supposed to integrate into the modern Windows application world. And also important is that it's the best performing application, spending a lot of time taking care of issues with things like .NET NGen compilation, so that the application runs as efficiently as it can when it gets out to the end user. Now, my attitude in automation has really changed quite a bit. Folks who have been doing config manager packaging have really been using automation for a long time, and that's really the way that they do things. They usually take the installer in from the vendor. They'll use something like Admin Studio or Wise Studio, Wise Installer, repackage the installer from the vendor and get it configured the way they want. In the AppV world, I haven't done that for the longest time. I've always preferred using the GUI as part of that sequencing experience. And the reason that we would do that in AppV is that we would then use that as a way to produce the documentation, showing screenshot by screenshot, here's how we install this thing, giving us an opportunity to put in some comments in there about why we chose a particular option. And we'd have a really nice documentation package so that when 2 years from now, somebody else has to take that same software, maybe a new version of it, and produce a package, they've got some really nice documentation about how we did the previous one and why we did those things. In the last year and a half, I've really moved more towards the automation. And while the automation is a little more work initially, it actually ends up being a lot less work in the long run. And surprising to me, the other thing I found is that my accuracy and quality of the packages that I'm putting out are much greater now that I'm doing automation than it was when I was doing things with the GUI version of the installer and the sequencer. So how do we do that? You know, we get an application in. One of the first things you do is you Google whatever the app name is and ask for silent install. And you usually find something about that application on one of these 3 websites. The original site was called App Deploy. Bob Kelly is the guy who started that in the day, and it was a fantastic site. At one point, he kind of sold it off and joined IT Ninja, which was later part of Case, and that kind of became the go-to place to find this information. And then Case has kind of repurposed what they're doing there, and Bob has left, and he has a new site now called App Details. But between these 3 sites, you're likely to find some decent information about how to get a silent or passive install of the application. Now, I say silent or passive, so technically silent install means you run the installer and there's no user interface component that's displayed at all. That's great for something like a config manager situation where you want that installation to kind of happen in the background and the user not even have an opportunity to interact with that installation at all. A passive install will show some of that activity, but not let the user necessarily interfere with it other than they can kill tasks, obviously. We tend to use the terms generically, as silent install is one of those things, and what I'm really doing with my scripting is actually passive installs, but there's no reason you couldn't be doing it as full silent installs as well. The second thing that I use is a PowerShell framework that I created called Silent Install. That's the name of it. And that's a free framework that's up on GitHub. It's a community project there. And it makes a nice framework for taking the installer from the vendor, and rather than going through a repackaging exercise, controlling it with whatever options they make available to us that we can find through the installer, and then fixing it up and fixing all the problems that are associated with it. And the various things that you're likely to want to do. So, for example, removing desktop shortcuts, turning off and disabling Windows services, like for updaters and things like that. Configuring it through a reg file. These are things that are just easily plugged into this framework. You just drop the piece in, and you've got your nice silent install for that particular application. So I'll show you some examples of how that's working. There's a link for where you can find that up on GitHub. If you can't remember anything else, you just remember GitHub Tim Mangan. You'll find the silent install framework up there. So let's not talk and let's go do. So I'm going to go over to my development system. No, I'm sorry, my packaging system over here. and let's go take a look at the framework up on GitHub. So here we are on GitHub. You can just go ahead and grab those files. There's really two important files, this silent install ps1 and the utilities.ps1. So the utilities.ps1 is a file you're just going to use. It's got the backend functions. The silent install.ps1 is the file that you would modify for every application that you want to package up. There's also this run.cmd that's here and this install dependencies.ps1. Those are useful for working with the auto sequencer that I'll also be talking about. But if we just go ahead and take a look at the silent install at PS1, it's a ton of documentation on how you use it in here. But basically, you end up coming down into this area and adding in the name of your installer and whatever install options you have to put with that. Now, it's set up so that we can have a single file here and to be able to bruise both 32 and 64-bit packages. And sometimes they're separate installers, sometimes they're the same, but we just add the installer we want in for the appropriate level of bitness. The framework here will handle MSIs, EXEs. It'll handle zip files where the argument would be the folder you want to unzip and extract into. It'll handle CMDs, BATs, and PS1 files. In addition, we have these copy files. So if we have a few extra files we want to copy in and not necessarily have an installer, we're able to add those in by just editing those lines and uncommenting them. This is the log file that the installation will log out to, so we can capture and take a look at what happened here. Here's where we would remove shortcuts. So we just put in the name of the shortcut file, the LNK, and it'll find where it is. You know, if it's in all users or the current user, it would find it if I just put it in that area here. We may have some additional files we want to remove. So a lot of installers like to leave this uninstaller behind, and I want to pull that out. We may also have some environment variables. So the sequencing I'm doing now with the auto sequencer runs on Windows 10. One of the problems I haven't solved in Windows 10 is that through the auto sequencer, I always end up catching this environment variable that Windows creates for me because I logged in. Usually about 2 minutes after you log in, this environment variable called OneDrive gets created. I haven't figured out exactly where Microsoft is doing that. So rather than prevent it in my VM image, I just remove that environment variable every time it shows up. We can also disable the services here, and then here's where we end up taking care of the NGen compilation. So these are the standard things that you do for most of your packages. You'll do things in this area. Another thing that you might do is you might have a reg file, and all you do is you drop the reg file in the folder with these scripts, and it'll automatically pull that in for you. I do have a secondary down here, so I may have an application that has no installer, and all I really end up doing up at the top here is copying an exe in with the copy files. Well, then I could come down in this section here, and we show you an example of how to create a shortcut to that. So now you've got a package that has both the executable, you have your shortcut, you get your icon set appropriately, and you're good to go. So this is the kind of editing that you do there. Let me talk a second here about the auto sequencer. So the auto sequencer is something new that Microsoft came out with last summer. So this is a new component. It's released as part of the Windows ADK. So the AppD sequencer, when you want to work with Windows 10 and Server 2016, is now released through the Windows ADK, and it has to be. It can only be that version can only be installed on those newer operating systems because it depends upon the bits from the AppD client, which were embedded into that operating system anyway. So if you're sequencing on the older operating systems, you still use the MDOT release version of the sequencer. Oh, by the way, there was a new drop for MDOT today. By the way, the September version just came out. So if you're working with those, you might want to look at the new version that just came out. Although I haven't actually had a chance to look at it yet. But what the way the auto sequencer will work is I'll work with a machine that has Hyper-V enabled. So I'm logged into a machine. I've got Hyper-V, and I have a VM here that's set up with the app sequencer installed. So the auto sequencer gets installed under the host operating system here. So what the auto sequencer does is it works with Hyper-V to manage this VM. And so it will revert it to the named snapshot it's looking for, which is right there. It'll start it up. It'll copy the installer files into place on it. It will first run any dependencies that we might have, like maybe SMBC runtimes or .NET 3.5 framework you want to get on place. And then it will run the sequencer with your silent install, capture that package, and then copy all that back off of the VM into the folder that you designate when it's done. It's actually a really nice process. I am just so happy that I've started doing it this way. That process itself gets handled through PowerShell here on the host. And you feed it in a file. I'll show you a version of the file. This is a display of the file using a tool that, that I'm using here in-house that shows me the entries in here. But basically, this is an XML file. And for all of the packages I want to do, I'll have an entry. It'll define what the package name is going to be. If I have some dependencies that I want to install, a folder where those are located, and then it'll run a command that's in there. The installation folder, so all of the main install that I want to do here, and then what command I want to run. And in my case, it's always just I'm running PowerShell with this silent install.ps1 file in that folder. And I can have as many of these things as I want in here. I've got a version here. If I load this up, you can see I got 61 packages in here. And if I want to package up all 61 of these, all I have to do is hit that one PowerShell command, which I've got behind this button here. And it'll just start that process up. And one after another, it'll create those packages. On average, it takes about 7 minutes per package right now. I can probably cut that time down a little bit. It takes about 2.5 minutes before it, after starting the VM, before it actually starts the sequencing process. And there's a delay in there I need to find. But even at 7 minutes, I'm happy. You know, these 61 packages, that's, you know, 10 or 11 hours. So I can just start it up, I come in the next day, and all of those packages are completed. So I've got one here. I'm just going to start one off here. Is I'll talk about what that thing is. So I've got load, and we're just going to run the one that's right there at the top. So I'll start that up. Sequencing starts, and we'll see here in a couple minutes. We'll see the window pop up as it actually starts to do that sequencing. So let me show you what I'm doing here, because this is actually related to the problem with some of the Citrix publishing that we've been seeing. So let me show you the installer that I have here. Go to Apps. And this isn't a real application. It's a test application I created to show the issue itself. All right, so this is the raw version, which is the one that we're sequencing. And all this is a single executable. It's a very simple executable. If I run it, it just puts up something and shows you what the command arguments were. The script that I've created here to mimic what the installer might be for something like this is simply just copying the file down. Whoop, I missed the copy. Right here. We're copying the file down into the program files area and creating 3 shortcuts. And the 3 shortcuts have different arguments on them, is the idea. And this is one of the problems we've been seeing with the Citrix integration into Studio right now. So, okay, here we see the sequencer kicking off here. I'm just going to minimize that and let that thing run. So I create that package, and let me take you over to the my Zen App system over here, and we'll bring up Studio. And I have brought that package in here. This is the version that I created yesterday. And if we take a look, it shows only one application. And that's the issue that we're seeing here. So let me show you the appv package itself. I meant to do that. So it would be on A. So this is what appv captures in that package. So this is the tool appv manage. So that's a free tool that you can get off of the T-Mergent website. We typically use that after sequencing an application. We come in and bring the package in. We could run the analyzer, produce some fixes. We can also do the testing by integrating with the appv client. Oh, I picked the wrong package. Oh my goodness. That's why that's taking so long. It's a huge package. All right, we're on a webinar, so let's save some time.
In that regard, Tim, could you maybe comment on what kind of criteria you use to figure out at what point is it really worth trying to tackle a really, really huge package versus much smaller ones that are generally, much easier and much quicker to deal with?
So by that question, I'm assuming you mean doing it in appv as opposed to using something else for the deployment later on?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So looking at the package itself, I find that nearly impossible, meaning looking at the installer. So like, Citrix has their AppDNA technology, and it gives you these, red, yellow, or red, amber, green lights and that. I really don't find those types of tools are really helpful in telling me if this is a good appv package or not. It really comes down to what the integrations are. My number one criteria ends up in any organization, one of the first things they end up having to, or eventually they have to figure out, is how they want to handle things that plug into Internet Explorer and how they want to handle things that plug into Office. And those are general categories that you're either going to do it or you're not, And so one of the first things, if I've already made that decision that no, I'm going to deal with Office and anything that plugs into Office through means outside of appv, then that's what I'm looking for. And this tool should be showing me. Not sure what happened there. All right, let me go to the backup system. I have something funny going on there. Okay. This one, and let's pick. This is what I'm looking for. So that's to answer your question, Tobias. That's the first thing I'm looking at. The second thing is whether or not I just have problems. As you go through the testing, if you're having some issues, if the app doesn't launch straight out, you might try some of the checkboxes in sequencer. You might try p-batting it just to solve the kind of early launch issues. But beyond that, if the problem is really integration with other things, that's where if you're really good and know what you're doing in appv and the sequencing, you can probably work your way through those things. But if you don't have that level of experience, then that's where you kind of cut it off and say, hey, let's go ahead and do that through some other technology.
So basically trial and error.
Yeah.
Well, not so much trial and error, but trial by fire might be,
might be a little bit about
in
that.
other words, how much time and effort does it really take to make this work, and what are ultimately the gains in terms of performance? I mean, if it takes way longer for the application to launch via appv than it does natively, then you're not necessarily achieving any gains, at least as far as performance is concerned. Sure, in terms of convenience and the advantages, of course, that are offered through the packaging and the control mechanism, but it's all, of course, a trade-off.
It is, and everyone has multiple ways of doing things. I mean, generally, it's not a performance thing. It's more of a does it work. And I think that in the past, 10 years ago, we had a lot of customers who tried to put everything they could through AppV. This is back in 4.2 to 4.5 timeframe. I mean, I remember a hospital, and they put 95% of their packages through AppV. They had a guy who would work on a package for 2 months. And the reason he would do it is because he really didn't have any other way to get it deployed in his environment other than sending someone out with a USB stick. So he was willing to spend that amount of time. I don't see customers like that today. Everyone has multiple options. So if it makes sense, you use AppV. If it doesn't, you move on and use something else.
Okay, and I do have one question that has come in meanwhile, Tim. The question is, can sequences that are created with the auto sequencer be installed also on Windows 7?
Okay. The current best practices to that question is no. So traditionally, we could sequence on an older operating system. So for example, if I sequence a 32-bit on Windows 7 32-bit, I could take that package and deploy it on any newer operating systems, including the 64-bit versions. I couldn't go from 64 to 32, but if I started with 32, I could run it on 7, I could run it on 8, I could run it on 10, I could run it on the server operating systems as well. That used to be enforced by the AppV client. When Microsoft went from AppV 4.6 to AppV 5, they had to redo the packaging format, and it was so traumatic for customers that Microsoft has been very paranoid about not making changes to the AppV file format that weren't backward compatible. And I have now, I have 61 packages that I showed just a minute ago on the auto sequencer. Those were all done with the auto sequencer on Windows 10 64-bit. I've run every single one of those packages on Windows 7 64-bit. And they all worked just fine. So the OS compatibility that AppV has seems to be really, really good. But there's nothing from Microsoft that says that's a supported thing to do, to go from sequencing on 10 and going to 7. I think it looks really good, and if it works for you, go ahead and do it. If you end up with a problem, then fine. That's a package you're going to have to do with the old sequencer on 7 to get that out. So that's kind of my attitude right now. And that'll probably change over time, right? But that's where I feel about it right now. And as I get more and more experience with it, I might start getting a little more bold about saying, yeah, just go ahead and do it. Okay, anyway, so back to the problem. This is that package that was created with the 3 shortcuts. And to show you the problem we're seeing in Citrix, right? So extend this out so we can see the fuller. I'm sorry, this is my fixed version, unfortunately, right? Because we had to switch machines. But what we have is we have 3 shortcuts in the package. But as I go to back over to the Zen App server, when it sees the package, it's only pulling in a single application. And here's what that issue comes from. I'm talking with the Citrix developers. I'm hoping that they can do something about this going forward. But the problem is that when Citrix brings in the package, they're focusing on what Microsoft calls the App ID, which we can see on the far right over here. And the App ID for each of these packages is the same because the App ID is simply the path to the executable itself. And since these shortcuts are pointing to the same executable, they have the same App ID. And that's what's causing Citrix, when you bring that package into Studio, to just see that with a single application. So there's a couple of different ways that I fix that problem. And when I do, I end up with a package that when I bring it into Studio, it sees all 3 commands in there with the different arguments associated with them. So the way that I do that in terms of the silent install is, I'll show you a couple of different ways. Oh, I lost that folder, didn't I? It's because I'm on the wrong machine. There we go. Go back to emergent. And here we go. Okay. So the first way, which was really the simplest, since there was no real installer involved in that, and this was a very simple package, I just made 3 different copies of the application, giving it 3 different names. Just renamed the application, and then created the 3 shortcuts to the different executables with the different command line arguments I wanted associated with them. And that gave me a package that had the 3 different shortcuts associated with it that Citrix could take in. Now, if you think about having a larger application that might have some shortcuts in there, you probably don't want to be doing this file name copying thing. So I do have a second technique that I used. Here, this alternate here. And here I use a utility of mine called LaunchIt. So LaunchIt's another free utility. We've used this for the years to solve issues associated with launching the application, and the application shuts down, but it leaves some child processes behind. And LaunchIt is a way to take care of that. So I just add LaunchIt into my scripting here. And this is something that would work for any application you had. If it come down, so you would, there we go. You'd first do whatever your normal install was, and then I just added 3 copies of LaunchIt, renaming those, so I don't have to rename this executable because sometimes that can cause some issues. And then I have my shortcut point to LaunchIt, which then points to the command I want to run with whatever the arguments are here. Okay, so there's a command I want to run and its arguments. And so it just acts as sort of a launching pad so that I can have 3 different shortcuts to 3 different executables. And then Citrix also likes that if I bring that package in. In fact, let me go do that. We got time. Back over here in the studio. So we can go ahead and find the alternate package. Why is that not doing anything at the moment? My studio seemed to have stopped responding, so we'll skip past that. But basically, in working with AppV here, you can either take things from the AppV server, but quite frankly, I prefer to just do individual packages straight off of the share at this point. The user experience when they come in from storefront at that individual application, it performs so much better if you just skip the AppV server. Oh, okay, so Studio decided to stop talking to me today. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the analyzer as well. So I've shown a version of that here. Let's take a package that's maybe a little more hairy that'll have some issues. So let's take the vSphere console. Okay. So the analyzer will take a little bit longer. I have to add the package in to get the full experience on the analyzer. We'll let that happen. So what the analyzer is doing is it's breaking out the different interfaces it finds in the package. And it looks for typical kinds of issues. So there's a automated fix button that's in there. And that fix button, hey Tobias, remember how I said I had to rebuild my router this morning?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, maybe I didn't get everything right.
It's rearing its ugly head, probably.
That's what it's looking like. So the analyzer will go in and it will take a look at these interfaces. And one of the things that application installers are really bad at is file association conflict. And so if you get an application that wants to deal with zip files or graphic files, they want to take ownership of that. And traditionally, the installer would just go ahead and it would just take over ownership. And now, when the user went to work with that file, it would run with their application. That's what the vendor wants. Back in the Vista timeframe, Microsoft created this thing called application registration capabilities. That is the recommended ways that vendors do that. So they don't necessarily take over ownership, but instead it becomes something that becomes available to the user on a right click to set what default they want. And the application installer is supposed to do that. Most applications don't do that. I'm now 0 for 2. Okay.
Do you have time for a quick question, Tim?
Yeah, well, I try to see if I've got another backup I can go to here. Okay. Go ahead.
The question is, do you need a physical machine for to be able to run the auto sequencer?
Okay. You need something that's running Hyper-V. Okay. So now, I mean, with the newest versions of Hyper-V, you can do nested virtualization these days. So in that sense, that doesn't need to be a physical machine. But yeah, you do need pretty much a physical machine. I mean, I'm using these Intel NUCs. In this case, I could be doing it off of my laptop. Windows 10 has Hyper-V enabled in it or available in it. You just turn Hyper-V on, and then you've got a machine that you can just do that sequencing there locally by adding a VM to it.
But of course, if you're running a Hyper-V instance in Azure or AWS or whatever, clearly you could make use of leveraging that, right?
Right, you could be doing nested virtualization there. And
as long as you have a Hyper-V instance that you have pretty much full administration rights to, you should be good to go, right?
Yeah, yeah, you would be. Ultimately, the auto sequencer in the end is a whole series of PowerShell scripts. And the entire thing is in PowerShell. There's a couple of DLLs that they install when you install it, but those DLLs are actually just for the logging capabilities that are built into it. I have a blog post. Yeah, it looks like that one's not going to work either. I have a blog post that describes how I modify the PowerShell that they give us. But the concepts that are there could be applied to anything that has a hypervisor on it. It's just changing out because they're using the Hyper-V PowerShell interface to control the VM, to start it up, to revert it to the snapshot. There's no reason you can't do the same kind of thing with another hypervisor. It's just that it's up to you to do that. Microsoft is going to support Hyper-V. If you want to do that on another hypervisor, you'd be able to do that as well. But it's on you to do it. Okay, so we're going to the third level of backup here, which is a screenshot. Okay. So this is an example of a package where I've run the analyzer. And we have a little bit of yellow highlighting, which is trying to draw your eye to, hey, there's something here you should look at. If this were live and not a screenshot, I'd click on this application button. Whoop, I shouldn't click when I do that. I'd click on that application button and I would then see the details of the application. Now in this particular package, this is the SolidWorks draft site. Now, the reason there's some yellow in there is that there's an executable that's in this package that has an internal manifest that says require administrator. Many times that's going to be something like the uninstaller, which I might want to clean out or I don't care about, but it may be that this is an application that I really can't deploy out to a standard user without them having admin capabilities, and I want to make sure that you're aware of that. Back here, the other yellow that I see over here has to do with the fact that this is an application. So the vendor has both EXE and MSI installers. Well, if you take the MSI version of their installer, it doesn't do NGen compilation as part of the install. So it's got these .NET components, and there are 19 of them in this package, and they didn't compile any of them, which means it's going to run very inefficiently on the target system when you use the MSI installer. So this is something that we capture in here, and then the installer fix-ups will give us a way to fix that. Some of the other things the installer fix-up is looking at is both the application capabilities and app path registrations. So the way that ends up working is you click on that button, and the things that are appropriate will be highlighted here that it could produce a fix for. And when you hit the Generate Fix button, based on what the checkboxes you have here, you end up with a PowerShell script that you would then run. So if you think about the silent install script we had before, I just drop that in the same folder, rerun my automated sequencing, and it'll pick up this script, run the other stuff first, and then do these additional steps to fix the problems that it found. So in this particular case, we have some problems in certain types of shortcuts with AppV. This is different than the problem with Citrix that I'm talking about. This is just general AppV issues with shortcuts that have spaces and things like that. The application capabilities registration, well, this actually did the right thing in there. App paths, which is starting to become more and more important. If you think about the way users go when they go from Windows 7 to 10, they're very used to coming in here and starting and typing a command. Like I say COMT, I should see control panels show up. That only shows up because there is an app path registration for the control panel in the Windows registry. And so as I see applications that don't have that, we now get this checkbox, and when you have that script there, it'll add that stuff in for you. So you get that type of capability in. The user doesn't have to type in the full name of the executable to be able to launch it from the Start menu search area. The application in many cases, right, this isn't live. The application in many cases has a lot of files in the installer cache. Some people like to automatically clean these things out, and some don't. So what I've done here, the reason you don't necessarily clear everything out of the installer cache is that sometimes there are shortcuts or icons or file associations that are in that installer cache. So if you just blindly delete all that stuff, you end up breaking your package. The analyzer will figure out if any of those things are being used, and the installer fix associated with that will only delete the things that aren't needed, so we can clean up that package a little better there. All right. Okay, so we've kind of shown the way that I'm doing that packaging. Let me just go back to that slide. Okay. And the way I'm doing the packaging and really producing some very nice packages through this method. So it's really using that automation, using the sequencer so that I can understand what's being laid down by that installer, and then running the analyzer, producing the fixes that we want, and then coming up with a really good installation script. And because I'm an AppV guy, I'm going to run through that process again and produce my final AppV package, which is going to be the best end user experience and the most performant that I can possibly make that package. So that's the concept behind here. So I showed you that, and then I showed you the fix associated with getting things into Studio when the package has more than one shortcut to the same executable. And with those, I think you're in pretty good shape. We actually talked about the other thing I was going to talk about, which is sequencing on Windows 10 with the auto sequencer and going back to run on Windows 7. Here I'm putting up some links here for some of the things that I showed you. So the auto sequencer, again, you get through the Windows ADK these days. The tools that I showed you, you can use here in the webinar, AppV Manage and Launch It. Those are both free tools off of my website. And then the silent install framework up on GitHub. So how are we doing on questions, Tobias?
We are pretty much caught up at this point.
Really? Oh.
So yeah, I mean, everything is so crystal clear that I guess everyone is left with a full knowledge base. I was going to actually throw in what kind of difficulties have you experienced in terms of the sequencing, dealing with, in particular, applications being done for Windows 7 versus Windows 10? Have there been any significant, outstanding issues that have cropped up, in particular with Windows 10, or has it been pretty much a smooth transition?
I think the transition of the apps themselves have been very smooth in terms of AppV. I mean, I don't know of any apps that you can if the app worked on Windows 7 and it sequenced on Windows 7, assuming the app works on Windows 10, sequencing on Windows 10 is a no-brainer. In fact, you just reuse that same package if you want, or you can sequence it on 10. They work. The things with Windows 10 that we're seeing as a challenge, and my experience right now is that I'm spending a lot of time in Europe. The Europeans are actually a little bit ahead of the US, I think, in terms of the Windows 10 deployment, and they have a little more experience out there. And they're having challenges just like the folks in the US are in terms of just going to Windows 10. It's not an AppV thing. It's how do you deploy and manage Windows 10 is different than it was in Windows 7. And Microsoft has done a number of things, particularly in terms of, you take a look like the file associations. We have one way that file associations work for standard applications, and we have a different way that they work for universal apps. And that causes a conflict when you have file association conflict between those two types of things. So as we have things like Paint going away now in 1709, and it's going to be this Paint 3D that wants to own all of those graphic formats, that's a Windows Universal app. And now when you try to put another application that's a traditional application on that machine, that's where we start to have some challenges. How do we manage that and control it and get the file associations the way we want to? And that's just a general Microsoft thing that everyone's kind of learning how to deal with as we go through the process.
Absolutely. Just one comment here, a big thank you, wonderful presentation.
Okay.
Which is great. Another question that I had was, do you see any added challenges now in creating packages that specifically are running, for example, in a Zen app environment? Do you try and optimize your Zen app environment before you start building the packages that are going to be running under AppV, or do you create the AppV packages, run them under the Zen app environment, and then try to assess what tweaks might be beneficial to make things run more optimally in the Zen app environment?
Yeah, I think in general, I would I start that first level of optimization outside of Zen App. So I just use a standard Windows desktop, do that level of optimization that's there. For the most part, you know, once you get past for the most part, the optimization of the Zen App environment is as a Zen App environment as a whole, and then also as how you're using it with AppV in general, and it's not package specific. Now, having said that, there are some times when there's going to be something that's specific that crops up, and it's usually in the Zen App environment. It's all about launch time. You know, how long does it take for that application to come up? On a physical desktop, it's usually pretty quick. But we've got a lot of other components that are in between storefront and AppV even starting to do that launch. And so, you know, we want to make sure that we've got that experience optimized. And that's the primary reason I say don't use the AppV server and do with the packages directly. Because when we do it with the AppV server, as we go through that launch process, the Citrix AppV launcher does a full package refresh with the AppV server. So it logs in the user and then says, oh, go do a full package refresh. So all of the applications get published in that environment, and then it runs the one application you want. Whereas when you do it with the individual apps brought directly from the package share, CTX App Launcher only deals with that package and the, you know, the connection group associated with it, isolation environment, or we're calling it in Studio. And you know, just brings only the packages necessary for the thing the user clicked on, and that produces a much faster launching environment for the end user. So that's why I prefer to do that.
Here's another question that came in, Tim. Have you explored combining an AppV layer with Unidesk, or is this too complex or too redundant?
We've done some playing with it, so yes, you can do that, but I think the complex and redundant is the likely to be the issue. Certainly putting the AppV client in the base layer as part of the operating system. I mean, you know, think about, you know, taking the app layering and using that as just your image generation tool, you know, rather than doing the MDT and having split up. That makes absolute sense. You put the AppV client in there and you have it set. I really prefer to keep my packages out of there. Could you do it? Yeah, you could, but I'm not sure why you would, quite frankly. I think it's just adding layers of complexity and more things to break.
That makes sense. You know, certainly launch times and run times are, of course, extremely interesting. Have you seen some market benefits with running applications on servers that have the ability to tap into GPUs?
I would say no, I haven't. I'm not really dealing with customers that are doing those kinds of applications. I think generally, if you're dealing with that type of an application, you're probably not going to be looking. That's more of a dedicated, workstation scenario. I think, you know, we'll be getting to the point where that starts to make more sense in things like Azure to make use of. I hear you're talking about using the GPU compute capability as opposed to the graphics capability, right? So we're usually talking about, you know, large scale, you know, mapping applications and things like that.
Well, really, actually, you know, anything that can be taken over by the GPU computationally is an advantage, and it could be both calculations as well as graphics specific types of things. I mean, it's a general purpose accelerator, or it can be used, of course, to that effect. And I was just curious whether the I mean, clearly the runtimes are going to be positively affected. I was curious whether any tests had been done in terms of improving also potentially the launch times.
No, as I said, I'm not really working with anybody that's in that space. I mean, I'd love to. I think it would be a cool thing. You know, in terms of it working with AppV, I don't think it would be performant. There wouldn't really be any difference in terms of the performance if you deployed such a thing using the AppV technology or not. It could open up some opportunities, you know, again, where we can do things like eliminating the conflict to be able to have two different versions on the same system at the same time. You know, those kinds of things are potentially something you might want to take advantage of. But I'm currently not working with anybody that's doing that.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, I think we're all caught up actually on questions, and timing really couldn't be much better. I would like to thank, first of all, the audience for their questions and their interest and hanging in there. If there are any follow-up questions or discussions, please notice the link that Stephanie has posted on the chat session area, that it will be possible to continue the discussions if you so wish. And at this point, I'd like to certainly extend my sincere thanks to Tim for his time and efforts behind putting all this together. Really interesting stuff, and it's exciting to see how things continue to evolve in this direction. And with that, I'm going to turn this back to Stephanie. If she is still here. Which she may not be. And if that is the case, Tim, do you want to leave any parting words here?
Only that remind you, we've got a lot of free tools that are available up here on the website, and if you want to know more about how to do the best job of packaging AppV apps, I think you know where I'm at if you're on this call. So come find us.
Here I am.
Oh yeah, so good. I was going to say the only thing that concerns me is I'm not sure. Oh, here it is. Okay, I didn't want to stop the recording prematurely without your permission. So
no problem. Thank you, Tobias. Thanks everybody for being on the call, and thank you, Tim. Sorry, sometimes GoToWebinar doesn't play nice and it kicks me out. But we appreciate everyone being here today. All right.
Thanks everybody.
Yes, thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.